So I've been a professor at Kingsborough Community College for over 20 years, and I was very glad when Maureen came on board and started many events that promoted social justice. And, you know, we shared a similar view of education and politics. So I'm very grateful to her. And now I have to read to make sure I don't forget anything, but she's a detailed researcher and scholar with a love for historical literature, particularly from Irish and African-American writers. Her research looks at imperial borders and national partitions, at political justice, especially reparations, at social justice of race, class, and gender, and the poetics of conflict, trauma, and silence in poetry and in prose. Maureen has studied and researched and produced a huge volume on Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, and I'm eager to hear how Maureen interprets Toni Morrison's Beloved as a claim for clarion call for redress and reckoning and a case for reparations.
Great. Thank you so much, Madeline. Thanks to Madeline Sorrell and Dror Khan, my friends who invited me to give this talk, and much thanks to BSEC for some reason it switched me the view. I like to see everyone. Thank you, BSEC, for putting my talk on the agenda. Also, kudos to this organization for having not one talk on Beloved, but two. Last month, a month ago today exactly, another individual, Christian Hayden, gave a brilliant talk on Beloved, which I was there for. And I loved it. Very different from the one I'm about to give, a very different approach. You know, great art, as we know, right, is always, you know, endlessly fascinating and endlessly meaningful. So two very different approaches to Beloved, but this is quite important politically right now, right? Because Beloved has specifically been under attack, not just the work of Toni Morrison in general, but this novel specifically, right? It's been claimed that the novel gives students nightmares. And, you know, but I think really sort of the subtext of that situation is, heaven forbid we teach a book, right, that undoes the racism that our students have learned, right? Or that undoes like problems in our thinking. And I think that's really the reason that this novel specifically has been attacked. So thank you. Also, we are doing this event in connection with Women's History Month, which is perfect on several levels. First of all, because Toni Morrison is, you know, her legacy is remarkable and outstanding. She was a Nobel laureate. She you know, has just a unbelievably eclectic and brilliant and influential oeuvre, right, of work that she published. She was also an editor, right, for many years, and she did amazing work as well as an editor. But also the book itself, Beloved, is based on another woman who I mentioned earlier, Margaret Garner. And so just for those of you who may not have read the novel Beloved, which is obviously fine, you don't have to have read it to follow along today, because I do explain things, but just to give you a sense of, you know, the sort of the premise of the novel, right? Margaret Garner was a woman who was enslaved in the state of Kentucky. She was born a slave, she died a slave. And she had, with her common law husband, she had 4 children. And at a certain point, the children, and she and her husband, the children, and a total group of 17 slaves from different plantations in Kentucky escaped in a sort of planned escape with help of the Underground Railroad. And in the novel, the character that is the Margaret Garner character, her name is Seta. In the novel, Morrison is a novelist. She's telling a story. She's fictionalizing the history, right? She's doing certain things that don't align with the actual history, but are based on it. In the true story, Margaret Garner and her husband crossed over the state line into Ohio. But because the fugitive slave laws had already been passed, her owner in Kentucky and his henchmen were able to cross state lines and continue hunting them down. So in reality, when Margaret Garner and her husband arrived at the safe house in Ohio, they didn't even have one day of freedom. The owner and the sheriff and others showed up that very same day. This is, and then what, you know, in basically we have a war going on right now in Ukraine. Well, in this instance, there was actually a battle that ensued between those trying to recapture the Garner family and those trying to keep them safe. So members of the Underground Railroad, you know, it was a shootout. I mean, it was a real battle, but they lost. And so as soon as Margaret Garner realized that they had lost this battle, she basically had a knife sort of sitting nearby and tried to end the lives of her children. She only ended the life of one of her 4 children. The other 3 lived. And so this story is Toni Morrison discovered Margaret Garner in sort of, you know, the dustbins of history, right? And wrote this novel. Now, in the novel, when we begin, it's 18 years later. Seta, the woman based on Margaret Garner, and her living daughter, Denver, are living in a house. They're actually living in the safe house in Ohio that they had arrived to. And the house is haunted. And so it's a ghost story. Beloved is a ghost story, right? It's a story about a haunted house. It's a story about a family that is haunted. It's a story about a nation that is haunted. And so that's really sort of the premise of the story. Now, you know, when we think about, like, you know, storytelling and hearing stories and, you know, reading stories, we know that a story has a meaning in terms of the story itself, right? So a story has a moral, right? And the moral is the meaning of the story. And we know that, and that is of course true. But stories, artistic stories like novels, right, make meaning in multiple ways. So there is the story itself and the incidents that occur. But there are other ways that Toni Morrison is working, a whole complex litany of ways, right, that Morrison is working as a novelist to make meaning, or to make meanings, plural, right? And so I focus on 2 of those ways, not exactly the story itself, but the form of the story and the crafting of the story. And these are other ways that she is working to build the meaning or meanings besides just the incidents themselves. So the form, right? So in terms of getting us to, you know, my argument, as we have said already, is that Beloved, as a novel, as a story, as a work of art, Beloved is a case for reparations, right? It is an artful, artistic case for reparations, but it is a case for reparations nonetheless that lines up, right, with the many, many cases for reparations that have been brought to courts, almost all of which have failed, right? Since 1865, nearly every single legal case that has been brought forward for reparations has failed. Now, in recent times, we've seen a few instances of, like, the city of Evanston, Illinois, right, we've seen a few instances of little, right, a city, a town, whatever, doing little, which is wonderful and fantastic. But we have not seen, as the quote from Morrison, right, you know, she says, we don't have a memorial, we don't have any kind of, right, remembrance of this history and the individuals who perished and suffered because of it, right? So craft, and form are my focus. And so just to give you a sense of what I mean, when I say the form of the novel, I mean, like, you know, questions we're familiar with, like, is it an epic? Is it a romance novel, right? Is it a Gothic novel? That's what I mean by form. In the case of the novel Beloved, Beloved in my reading is a tragedy. And I don't just mean a tragedy as in it's tragic, right? It is tragic, but it is a tragedy in the classical, formal, official sense of how do we define, you know, how do we understand what tragedy is? The fact that it's a tragedy means many things, which, you know, I won't get into all those things, but the fact that it's a tragedy means a couple of important things that have to do with my argument about reparations. First, a tragedy is a story of justice. So the soul, the core, the DNA of a tragedy is justice. So a tragedy, Hamlet, Oedipus Rex, Antigone, right? These stories put a question before the viewer, or the viewer of the play, or the reader of the book, right? They put a question before us, which is the question of justice. What is the crime that was committed, right? And what is the justice for that crime? How is the story going to be told in such a way that the justice question is resolved? Okay, so that's first. So another thing that I think is important in tragedy, and is important for Morrison's novel and was important to her, is that in a tragedy, the heroic figure or the protagonist in the novel, we call them a tragic hero in tragedy, or a tragic figure, they will find themselves eventually in what we call the tragic paradox, which is simply a situation that is not easily resolved, and a situation almost always in which, to do the right thing, the tragic figure must also do a wrong. They must also commit another wrong. So we think of someone like Antigone, right? I don't know if you were familiar with Antigone, you don't need to be. But that situation where Antigone's job in the play, in the story, in the mythology, is that she needs to defy the laws of the state in order to do what is right for her family, right? In order to follow the laws of the, quote, the gods, right? The natural laws of what do you owe your brother, right? But in order to do that, she has to defy the laws of the state. She has to go against state law. And so that's very important. And I think it's, you know, it's sort of, when we remember, right, that Beloved is Morrison's first novel, or it is her novel of slavery, her novel about slavery, then we start to see some of those connections, right? The institution of slavery was wrong. It was a wrong state edict, right? The only way to resist that condition is to break those laws. Okay, secondly, the crafting of the novel. And this is also quite important when we think about, and we're talking about slavery and the question of reparations. And that is that, now when I say the crafting of the novel, I mean, how is it artful, right? What is the artistry? What are the tools of the storyteller, the tools of the tragedian, right? The tools of the novelist. What tools did Morrison bring, you know, in her sort of arsenal? She was a storytelling genius, right? As I'm sure some of you would agree with me. What were the tools that she brought to this novel specifically? Because they're different from novel to novel. You know, so, you know, in jazz, even though jazz is part of a trilogy with Beloved, totally different artistic design in jazz, totally different artistic design in Paradise, the other novel that's part of a trilogy with Beloved. In Beloved, Morrison worked, again, in my reading and interpretation in my argument, Morrison worked from the object. So I would say that Beloved is a novel of objects. That is to say, objects, things, items, things held, things tasted, things worn on the body, earrings, right? That the baby remembers her mother wearing. This is very evident. If any of you who have read Beloved, this is very, very evident first in the very first chapter. When we come to the end of the first chapter, there's this very memorable scene with Denver, the daughter, Setha's living daughter, and she's sitting on the porch. In that scene, Denver is surrounded by objects, and every one of those objects she is surrounded by is profound, layered, symbolic, complex. And so we see it right away from the very first installment, and that what I would call a poetics or crafting of the novel continues from the beginning of the novel all the way through to the very last word. So Morrison was working through and with a poetics of the object. And how is this important? Well, it's really important as a background, as a scrim behind the story Beloved, because what was the chief, number one, most damning problem of the institution of slavery and the laws that governed that state, the slave state? Well, number one was that if you were a slave, you lost your personhood. You lost your person status under the law. You were an object under the law and not a person under the law, right? And so this is very, very important. It is not accidental. The design of the novel as a novel of objects is not accidental. It was strategically chosen, both because the objects of the novel bring us closer to it. The objects of the novel bring the story closer to us, which is also part of what she was trying to do. And she talks about that in different interviews. But the object poetics, the object's design of the novel is also part of her development of this novel into a case for reparations. And I'm going to say more about that in a second. Okay, are you with me so far? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to continue now. Now, when we think about both these things now, tragedy, and thank you, Phil, the tragedy and the object's design, right? The object's poetics of the novel. When we put them together, what's the math of that, right? What's the answer to that math problem? Well, the answer to that math problem is that central tragic scene in which the tragedy unfolds right at the center of the novel. It is literally the center of the narrative, right? Of the book itself is where she places the tragic moment, again, by design. And so we see in the novel, remembering that Setha is Margaret Garner, that what's happening with Setha happened to a real woman who was enslaved and was trying to keep her children from being taken back into slavery, right? So here we have a situation in which, for Margaret Garner, for Setha, the fictional character who is based on her, there is not any way for her to protect her children because she is an object under the law and not a person under the law. Therefore, she doesn't own her own body. She doesn't own her children. She is not their mother, even though she is, right? Her children effectively have no parent because her children born into slavery under the laws of the slave state belong to whoever her owner is. So what this means for a person like Margaret Garner, who is in a situation in the year 1855, right? Who is in a situation where she has just, imagine what she went through to get her children to freedom. I mean, it's right, the book is imagining that, but we can also imagine it, just right? What it took for her to get 4 children, her husband, and a whole bunch of other people, right, together to Ohio, to a safe house, and into the protection of the Underground Railroad. They arrive. They don't even have one night of sleep, of rest as free people, right? So in other words, someone snitched on them, which is part of the novel too, because the sheriff arrived only hours after they did. So, right, so somehow they knew, where they were going and followed them there. And so now with the sheriff showing up, Margaret Garner's in a situation, which law does she violate? What, this is her tragic mind. This is the tragic paradox that was created by the laws of the slave state for any slave, right? Any slave who has a child. What does she do? Does she protect her child, which is her mother's duty, right? Does she allow her child to go back into enslavement, which she knows the horrors of, right? That's violating her mother's duty, right? Or does she do the only thing she can do, right, which is take the life of her child, because if her child lives, her child never belongs to her. It is never her child. And so she's in a situation where in order to do the right thing as a mother, she must do the wrong thing as a mother, right? As mothers, right? Mother laws, the natural laws of the mother. We don't kill our children, right? We also don't allow our children to be taken into a lifetime of suffering. So again, this is why tragedy? Why the object, right? Why was Margaret Garner not able to protect her children? Because she was an object under the law. She was considered a thing under the law, property under the law, and not a person. Therefore, she has no right to be injured even and bring a case of injury to a law court. Injury is only possible if you are a person under the law and not a thing under the law. So this is very important. Now, how do we get to reparations? We get to reparations from these large structural parts of the novel, right? We get to reparations through a number of different ways, really. It isn't quite this simple, but primarily what cinches the understanding of this novel as a case for reparations are two object lessons. And they are both about objects. One is a grammatical object. The other is a person who is an object under the law, and that is the child who died at her mother's hand, who is called Beloved in the novel. That's not actually her name. That is what she is called. That's her word. It is the word that her mother was able to get carved into the stone marking her grave. It's not her name, it's her word. So the first is Beloved. Beloved, as we know, she is the only character in the novel who was born a slave and died a slave. That is to say, she died still an object under the law. She never achieved her rights under the law to be the person that she was. And so Beloved is a very important figure in this story. She's read in lots of different ways, Some people read the character of Beloved as, a vampire character. Some people read her as a zombie kind of character. There's all kinds of interesting readings of this character. She's definitely Morrison's most complex and most disputed character. So the figure of Beloved, what happens, I want to give you the trajectory because this is how we get to reparations, right? Just the trajectory of this character, her comings and goings. Beloved is first a ghost in the house. She is haunting the house. The family knows that the ghost in the house is her, the dead sister. And the first thing that happens in the novel is that, so Denver and her mother, Seta, have been living in the house, the haunted house, for 18 years. And her two sons have left the house. They got tired of being haunted and they left. The grandma, Baby Suggs, has died. So it's Seta, the mother, and Denver, the living daughter, living in the house, and the house is haunted. At the very opening of the novel, the first thing that happens is a traveler, wanderer comes knocking at the door, and that is the character called Paul D. Paul D is an amazing and interesting and another fascinating Morrison character. But the first thing Paul D does on arriving to the home is he scares the ghost off. So Seta invites him into the house. She's going to make biscuits and they're going to have a little afternoon tea. And he comes in and immediately feels the ghost. He feels the presence of the ghost, and the ghost starts to wreak havoc, throwing things and wreaking havoc, as ghosts do in ghost stories. And Paul D basically tells the ghost to quit the house and gets into a melee with the ghost. And as Morrison says in the novel, afterwards it was rock quiet. The ghost was gone. It worked. The house is no longer haunted. Paul D has arrived. Now Paul and Seta are going to fall in love, right? Denver doesn't really like Paul at first, but eventually she'll come to like him and understand what's going on. And so all of that is happening, right? So that's the beginning. We start with the haunted house. The ghost is exorcised, and now we carry on until we don't. Until we get to the fifth installment. I have to say fifth installment because Morrison did not number the chapters. So, I can't really say chapter 1, 2. It's just the fifth part in part 1. We get to the fifth installment, and that's actually, I'll show you, that's actually depicted here. So this was my first. I have 17 copies of Beloved now, probably all written all over. This one was my first, actually. And this is the movie tie-in edition. And what you see here is the visual from the film of the resurrected beloved, right? The resurrected sister who died 18 years earlier. She is leaning against a tree, obviously a symbolic tree of life, right? She is dead, yet Morrison leans her against, right? A tree in the yard, a symbolic tree of life. And so what happens in the fifth installment, and this is really the sentence that started the whole novel off, it begins, the fifth chapter, a fully dressed woman walked out of the water. And this was really, Morrison quit her job finally as an editor and decided to, commit herself to her life, her role as a novelist fully. And this was shortly after her freeing herself from this full-time job. And she was sitting by the Hudson River where she had a house, and just kind of watching the waves, the Hudson, and suddenly she gets this vision, right, of this woman coming out of the water, fully dressed, nice hat, nice boots, right, dressed, right, fashion, and she sees this woman emerging from out of the water. So you realize, right, that part of what Morrison's thinking about, is this way that, as she mentions the Mississippi River in that quote that we just heard, right? And she's thinking about all of the souls of the dead of slavery sort of at the bottom of the river, at the bottom of the Atlantic, souls, spirits, no justice for them, right? No reckoning for them. And this is part of, right, what she's thinking about. So here comes this woman as if, right, one of those souls from the bottom of the river, which is also a story by Jamaica Kincaid, which I think she was thinking about too, right? But this woman coming out of the water, and this is the ghost. And now the ghost, as if she sort of said, "You think you're going to get rid of me that easy?" Right? And she's, so it's as if this ghost is able to defy physics and reemerge into the world in a living human body. And yet she is still dead. She is still a ghost. She is a terribly, terribly complex character. Now, we see very quickly that beloved is not lovey-dovey daughter come back to reunite all warm and fuzzy with mom. No. Beloved is a Greek fury in my reading, or a Greek American fury in my reading, right? In other words, really they were called the Erinys, but we're more familiar with the term fury, right? So beloved is really a fury. She is an arbiter of justice. She is like the Furies in the sense that the Furies' job in Greek and Roman mythology, right, was to avenge the crimes of blood criminals. That is to say, those who killed a member of their own family. And of course, Seta is that, right? She is. That was her tragic bind. And so beloved is there to do what the Furies did, which is to drive her mad, which she nearly does, and to drive her into death, which she nearly does. And so we come now, the story unfolds, right? We come now to the end. The women of the town who have for 18 years have shunned Seta because they didn't like what she did. Right? They could not accept the tragic bind that she was in. They could not accept, right? And they did not forgive her. But now we come to the end of the novel, and Denver has sort of gotten herself out into the town finally and made connections. And this sort of stirs things up among the women of the town. And eventually they decide, maybe we've been a little hard on her. Like maybe we ought to, understand what she went through and so on. Finally, they come to the house. They decide this sort of demonic figure in the house menacing Seta, like that's just wrong, right? Like just no. And so they come to the house at the end, and they basically perform, a sort of beautiful love fest of prayer that they're saying, aloud, and song and keening, and they perform this beautiful sort of exorcism. And sure enough, there's beloved standing on the porch, and poof, in a puff of smoke, she's gone, right? So the spiritual ritual worked, just like when Paul, right, asked her to quit the house, it worked, or we thought it did. Then she comes back, right? Now the women come, they forgive Seta, they love, they bring their love, and beloved disappears. So at this point in the novel, as readers of the novel, we're like, right? Because we're having that sort of emotional experience that you have when, like the bad guy is finally defeated and all is well, right? And so it's that sort of experience of relief. Now Seta's not going to die, and we forgive her too, and right, and then it gets even better when Paul D and Seta had sort of fallen in love. Then they broke up. Paul D comes back at the end. They have this beautiful romantic reconciliation. And so as readers of this novel, especially American readers, we have this experience of like, that's our happy ending, right? We got our happy ending. Paul D and Seta are back together. Seta's okay. The scary presence has been defeated. No. Basically, we have that reconciliation. It's one of the most beautiful romantic scenes I've ever read in a novel or any other type of work. And then we turn the page and there are 2 pages left. And we just sort of think, oh, okay, well, so it's just going to be the ending. But it's not. It's another beginning. Because what Morrison does on the last 2 pages of the novel is she brings beloved back a 3rd time. So what happens really in the reading of Beloved, if we're just thinking about, right, this one character, and we see her disappear from the novel, come back, disappear again. Oops, now she's back, right? When she comes back at the very end, and it is literally the tail end of a 300-page book, it's as if Morrison brings Beloved back in order to say to us, her readers, we are still haunted, readers, right? Beloved is back. It's like Morrison is sort of saying, I'm leaving her with you. reader, right? I'm leaving her. In other words, she comes back right at the tail end of the novel as if falling out of the novel, right? Falling off of the cliff or the precipice of the very end of the novel and falling into our laps as a question, as the justice question, right? And as a question that sort of says to us, you know, are we going to repair our crime? 400 years of criminality, right? In other words, back in 1865, right? We had an abolition, problem solved. It was done, right? We changed the Constitution, right? And we think this not done, right? Problem is still there. The racism is still there. The structural, institutional, educational racism, all still there. Now we come to 100 years later, 1964, Civil Rights Movement, the second abolition, right? And so we think, okay, now we have all these laws passed. We have laws protecting minority Americans in every way that matters: housing, voting, lending, employment. And so the problem's gone, right? Nope, the problem wasn't gone. And so what Morrison is saying and what I'm saying is that we need a third abolition, and we need it to actually be real, right? And that third abolition, I'm calling reparations. And when I say reparations in the book and right now, I don't just mean a check, right? I don't just mean mail checks. Mail checks, definitely mail checks, right? Great. Do it, because, you know, we have legacies, as that video showed us again and reminded us again, right? Legacies of poverty coming from this institution of slavery and continuing all the way through to now. But reparations needs to be much larger than just a check. A check is easy. You can allocate the funds and mail the checks. That doesn't mean, right? That doesn't mean any of the real problems have been solved. That doesn't solve the problem, for example, of mass incarceration. It doesn't solve the problem of the 13th Amendment having a loophole, right? You all are familiar with the loophole in the 13th Amendment, right? Which says slavery is outlawed unless you are a criminal. If you are a criminal, you can be enslaved. And it is on this basis, it was this loophole that literally it did not take 5 years after the end of the sweeping civil rights legislation, didn't even take 5 years, right? For that loophole to be remembered and used as a means to re-imprison, right? Slaves were imprisoned on plantations, right? And now we have the system of mass incarceration. So in my book, there's more to this, but I'm seeing the clock. The other object lesson I was going to talk about, I'll just say quickly, is the sentence in the novel where Morrison is quoting Shakespeare, and she is also quoting Aeschylus, two tragedies, right? The line, "The rest is weather." In fact, Morrison is quoting Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? Hamlet's dying words are, "The rest is silence." But Hamlet in the play by Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare was quoting Aeschylus, who wrote the line, "The rest is silence." So Shakespeare was quoting another tragedy. Now Morrison in her tragedy is quoting two previous tragedies. However, she can't say the rest is silence. There's been no justice. The rest is weather, right? Instead. And also remember, the word weather is the object of that sentence, right? It's not verb, it's not subject, it is object. So that's what I say is this object poetics, this object design is also part of the language itself. It's in that sentence. So that line is very important because that line regards beloved at the very end, the fact that she continues to roam the earth as a spirit. She cannot rest in peace. She can't say the rest is silence the way Hamlet could, right? Hamlet can say that dying because he did achieve finally the justice, right, for his father. But this is Morrison is saying, right, to us, we can't say that. we need justice, right? And that is, what I am calling reparations. So I think that's, in my book, I have a coda to my book in which I actually answer Morrison's question in her call. And I stop talking about beloved and I make the case for reparations in my final chapter of my book. So just, yeah, I think that's everything I had to say.
There we
Sorry, I'm
go,
a little bit over.
Maureen. Thank you so much. Whoa.